Imagine this, your opponent is within range of your bow. He can't reach you, all you have to do is just let go. The question is, would you do it? Because in history, a surprising amount of soldiers didn't. In something like a video game, it's easy. You see an enemy, you attack. No hesitation, because there are no real consequences. They are just NPCs. They'll just respawn. But in reality, that's a person, someone with a family, someone who might not even want to be there. Because we spend a lot of time talking about weapons, tactics, how efficient they are at killing our opponents. But we never ask ourselves the question if people were really willing to use these weapons. And that is what we're going to look at in this video. When we think about battles in history, any period, we think about people constantly trying to kill each other. But that's not always exactly how it happened. For example, some studies suggest that actually rather few soldiers during World War II, for example, fired when they saw the enemy. For example, Marshall's Men Against Fire suggest that only in between 15 and 25% of soldiers shot when they saw the enemy, meaning that essentially if a squad of people, let's say 10 soldiers, sees an enemy, only about 2 of them will shoot at that enemy. And that is obviously because you don't want to kill that innocent person that doesn't even necessarily want to be there. Now, to be fair, that 15 to 25% of soldiers who fired when they saw the enemy is very debated today, because there is essentially no proof that these numbers are true in any sort of way. They could be completely made up. But in any case, it does show that at least a certain amount of soldiers did not want to fire at the enemies, even though they could. And this was such a big problem during World War II that the training methods to train the soldiers changed. Instead of shooting at round targets and trying to hit the center of the target, they changed to human-shaped targets, so you would get used to shoot at any human shape you saw. And this means that in later wars, many more soldiers shot at the enemy, but that is only after artificial training with those human-shaped targets. Without those, humans tend to not want to shoot at other people. And early in history, we see the exact same thing. All the way from the Napoleonic Wars to essentially World War II, at least certain soldiers purposefully fired over the heads of their opponents, purposefully not to hit them. We have certain veterans from World War II saying they have done that, and some certain historical records from earlier periods of people saying they did that, or at least of commanders saying that their troops did that, shot over the heads of their opponents, even up in the air sometimes, because they did not want to shoot at the enemy. During the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of soldiers also seem to have reloaded their muskets without firing. A lot of muskets that have been found have been reloaded in between 3 and 10 times, with some of them even being reloaded up to 23 times. We have one example of a musket being reloaded 23 times without being shot. Now, part of the reason for this is that the gun might have misfired. So essentially, you reload your gun, you put it up, shoot, and essentially the gun misfires, so it doesn't shoot the bullet, and you think it has shot the bullet, so you reload the gun again and try to shoot again, but it misfires again. And so you just stack bullets into the barrel without ever shooting any of them. However, for the higher numbers of reloads, like for example 23 reloads in one single musket, it is very unlikely that you will reload your musket so many times without noticing that you haven't shot a single bullet. Because to a certain degree, you might think you have shot because you hear the sound of someone beside you shooting at that exact same moment, so you think the sound comes from your own musket, so you think you just shot or something like that. But obviously after 23 times you will notice that you haven't shot a single bullet, and there's nothing happening when you pull the trigger. And that shows that at least certain of these soldiers actually reloaded their guns, put them up, did not fire, and then just put it back down and reloaded it again. And that was probably because they did not want to shoot at the opponent that was over there, because you don't want to kill that other guy that's not over there, because he hasn't done anything particularly wrong. Even if you think it is fair to fight against whoever nation you're fighting against, that doesn't necessarily mean that that one person over there has anything to do with that, is actually willing to fight for whatever nation you're fighting against. So you naturally just don't want to shoot at that seemingly innocent person right over there. You prefer essentially just pretending that you were shooting without actually doing it. And then during executions with firearms, essentially you have one person standing there and the others line up and shoot at him. At least certain of the rounds within the guns were blanks, meaning essentially only gunpowder. There is no bullet in the gun itself. So you're essentially shooting, there is a bang, but nothing's coming out of the barrel. For example, the US Army 1944 procedure for military executions required 12 rifles with not more than 4 and not fewer than 1 loaded with blank ammunition. So essentially you would have 12 rifles and in between 1 and 4 loaded with blank ammunition, so essentially not shooting anything. And that was done officially so that the soldiers could convince themselves that they had not shot a real bullet, they had only shot a blank and had not been the one to kill the person. Because obviously if every gun was loaded with proper ammunition and you shot with proper ammunition, everyone would essentially blame themselves for having killed that one person and feel bad for the rest of their lives, essentially because they had shot that one person. If certain guns are loaded with blanks, you can convince yourself that you weren't the one to do it and you were actually shooting a blank. And then if we go back to later executions, we obviously have executioners who are using executioner's sword or axes or something like that. Now obviously when you're doing that, you need to be very precise but enough force in the swing to actually well, execute the person cleanly and not have to go for another swing to finish him. And in certain cases they missed, they did not put enough force in it, or you had apprentices that obviously needed to learn how to do it, which means that they didn't necessarily do it properly the first time. And this leads to certain executions being quite messy, and obviously people did not like that very much, because if you don't cut off the head in one blow, you will not killing in one blow, and obviously that can be quite messy if that happens. And that is what led to the invention of the guillotine by someone called Joseph Ignace Guillotin in 1789. Because it essentially was a machine that could do it cleanly every single time, and that was just a more humane way of doing it. So all of these examples are indications that a lot of people actually did not like at all to kill, and they would most probably hesitate a lot even during earlier combat. Obviously the examples were from rather modern periods of the examples I used, but that is simply because we don't have that much evidence, that many records from more ancient battles. But we can imagine that it was exactly the same during earlier periods. Now, before we go further, there is something important to understand, because not attacking doesn't always mean that you're hesitating to kill. There can be all sorts of reasons for not attacking. And now I'm talking especially about the World War II example with only in between 15 and 25% of soldiers shooting. There can be all sorts of reasons for why they did not shoot. It's not necessarily only because they did not want to kill their opponents. For example, you might be suppressed at that one moment, meaning that essentially if the enemy is shooting at you, if artillery grenades are landing around you or something like that, you probably want to stay in cover and not reach up to shoot, because that is essentially very dangerous. Then you also have range. You might be out of range completely or be at such a large range that shooting at that distance will probably only result in you wasting your ammo, not actually hitting anything. For example, if you have a gun that has a range of, let's say, 400 meters and you see an opponent at 400 meters, the problem is that you're probably not going to hit anything at that distance, even though the gun goes that far. So you're probably better off not shooting, because you're essentially just wasting your ammo. And speaking about ammo, you also have the problem that you might be low on ammo and actually want to spare it, so you're not going to shoot unless you desperately need it for some reason. For example, there is someone right close up on you. The target might also be unclear. You might be unsure whether that even is a person, or you might be unsure whether that's actually an enemy and not one of your own allies, because obviously you don't want to shoot at your own allies. And then you also have the fact that certain soldiers were not even supposed to shoot at specific moments. For example, if we take an average German squad, obviously you have all sorts of different sorts of weapons in a squad, but generally speaking, the classic equipment of a squad would be one machine gun, maybe two machine guns, and several riflemen. The riflemen were not supposed to start shooting before the machine gun was starting to reload. So essentially, the machine gun was doing all the shooting until it needed to be reloaded. And when you were reloading it, that is when the other soldiers, or the riflemen, would start shooting. And that is obviously because you wanted to constantly suppress your opponent, constantly have bullets flying towards them, because if the riflemen were not shooting once you were reloading the machine gun, the enemy could just poke the head up and just start shooting back while you were reloading. But the point is that if you see one enemy, the machine gun will start shooting at it, but the other people are not supposed to start shooting at it. And if the machine gun actually defeats that enemy before needing to reload, then the other ones have no reason to ever start shooting. And essentially you will have only one out of those 10 people having shot at the enemy when they saw him, but not because they did not want to shoot at the opponent or defeat him or kill him, just because they weren't supposed to do it, because that is not the orders they received. And if we're talking about earlier battles, so essentially you're fighting with spears, swords, whatever, just because you don't attack doesn't necessarily mean you didn't attack because you didn't want to kill your opponent. It can be simply because it was slightly risky to attack at that one point, because you would leave yourself open to one of his attacks if you attack, or because you're fighting several opponents that can attack you if you attack, and so on. You might want to focus on defending yourself. And obviously most soldiers, regardless of the period, are primarily trying to survive. They are not trying to be as efficient as possible. Their primary goal is to survive. So essentially, not attacking doesn't automatically mean that you're doing it because you're hesitating to kill. There can be all sorts of reason for not attacking. But obviously that doesn't explain everything, like for example shooting over the heads of your enemies, like for example firing blank ammo in executions or anything like that. And obviously a lot of the soldiers would not shoot or not attack because they did not want to kill or were hesitating to kill. And obviously this is because you naturally don't want to kill other people. It's just not an instinct that you naturally have. Partly because that one enemy that you're fighting isn't your own enemy. You are fighting for one nation that you don't necessarily want to fight for, and he is fighting for one nation that he doesn't necessarily want to fight for. But as I said, there is no natural instinct to kill other people. We have an instinct to fight each other to a certain degree, just like other animals fight each other, like for example wolves, for example. Wolves fight each other, but not to the death. They're essentially just fighting until one of them gives up. And that is a natural instinct that we humans also have, a natural instinct to fight each other, but not to the death. We have no instinct to kill another human because there is no benefit to do that in a more natural scenario. Obviously, with like civilization and so on, that has changed, but that is rather recent. So the natural selection haven't had the time to actually kick in and change that instinct. Now, obviously, your willingness to kill another person will also depend on the exact situation. If you're seeing an enemy at 400 meters distance, yes, you might not want to shoot at him at that distance because he is no direct threat for you. And if we take the example I used in the intro with you standing there with your bow ready to shoot, since the opponent is far away, he's not a direct threat for you, you are rather unlikely to want to do it. But if he is more of a threat to you, either because he also has a ranged weapon and can shoot back, or because you are close and you're essentially fighting in melee and he can attack you at any point, you are more likely to actually be willing to kill him because he's more of a threat for you. So essentially, if your life is directly threatened, or at least you think your life is directly threatened, you will be much more willing to actually shoot at your opponent, actually attack him, and so on. It's just that if you are less threatened, you are less likely to do it. And also training can overcome a certain instinct. You can, with training, as for example I explained with the human-shaped targets, you can overcome the instinct of not wanting to kill somebody with training, with actually getting used to shoot at human targets, for example. Also, there can be a certain amount of difference between different people. Some will have more problems with killing than others. But essentially, you have a certain amount of natural instinct that prevent you killing other people if you don't absolutely need to. And war essentially constantly pushes against those instincts because it essentially forces you to fight other people. Now, obviously, this does not mean that battles weren't deadly. It does not mean that no one will shoot at you if they see you. It's just that certain people, at least certain people, will hesitate to shoot at you or to attack you under certain circumstances. But if they are trained properly, if their life is directly threatened, or at least they believe so, then they are much more likely to attack you. And obviously, most examples I used here were around modern warfare, because that is from where we have the most evidence, but obviously this also applies, at least to a certain degree, to a more ancient warfare. Maybe to a lesser degree because you are fighting more in melee, where your life is more directly threatened, so you're more likely to be willing to attack. But that hesitation still is something that exists. And that also explains a lot about how different battles happened. We have talked about previously how an actual battle happens. It's not complete chaos, it's actually a formation trying to break up the formation of the enemy. But this idea of hesitating to kill actually comes and reinforces it, because if you're just running around in full chaos and fighting, you essentially have to kill other people constantly. When you're just trying to break up the enemy formation, you essentially aren't trying directly to kill them to such a large degree. You're essentially just trying to break up the formation, break them morale, so they flee. And most ancient battles only had a casualty rate of approximately 14% for the loser and 5% for the winner. Obviously, certain battles had essentially entire armies wiped out, but generally speaking, you're talking about a relatively low casualty rate, and part of the reason for that is that hesitation to kill, because you're not going full out in a battle and desperately trying to kill your opponent. You're essentially primarily trying to not die. So going back to that moment, you, with your bow ready to shoot, you can kill your opponent at any moment. But will you do it? Historically, some soldiers might hesitate, depending of course on the exact situation. So anyways, in the end, I think this is quite an interesting subject, because we're always talking about different weapons, how you can improve weapon, what is good, what is bad. But in the end, all of this doesn't matter. You can have the best equipment ever. If you're not willing to use it, then it doesn't matter. And that is actually a really important part of an army, actually having soldiers willing to use their weapons. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and let's see you in the next one.